good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dalia Colon. I'm a host and producer at WEDU PBS, and I never get tired of watching those clips from Finding Your Roots. So I understand that it's in between production seasons right now, but definitely stay tuned for some information about what's coming up on season 8. And I am joined today by two guests who I'm going to just let you both introduce yourself. I'll start with you, Sabin Streeter. If you've seen him in a panel before, you know why we invited him back. I told him you should do like a less good job next time and we'll stop taking up so much of your time. But Sabin, if you wouldn't mind, please introduce yourself.
I am the senior producer and one of the directors on Finding Your Roots. I've been on the show for quite a number of years, and I'm thrilled to be back. I love the show. We love Tampa. We love your station, and it's great to be back.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you for the second time. And a new member of our panel here is Beverly Steele. Tell us a little bit about yourself and also where you're joining us from, because that's really interesting to me.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beverly Steele. I'm the CEO of the Steele Organization, LLC, and I'm also the founder of Young Performing Artists Incorporated, a 501c3 not-for-profit. And we're actually headquartered in Central Florida in a community called Royal. Royal was formed in 1865 by former slaves, and as my aunt says it, from the old green plantation. And the beauty of Royal is that we here in this community are descendants of ones that received their 40 acres at the end of the Civil War. And we still have those 40 acres passed down through the generations, not just my family, but the families, the entire community. We've lost some of the partials, but most of the partials are still in their family lineage of the original owners. So that's one of the beauties of us.
That's amazing. I'm ashamed to say I had never heard of Royal until one of my colleagues mentioned the town to me. So where exactly is Royal, Florida? And when people hear that term 40 acres and a mule, what is meant by that?
Well, Royal, we are actually my mailing address says Wildwood. And because that's the adjoining town that's next to us, we're in Sumter County. And actually Royal is in the county part of Sumter and not in the city part of Wildwood. We're a standalone community. We're not a city like Eatonville. And I know some people are saying, but I thought Eatonville was the oldest African-American. Well, it is. It is the oldest African-American city. But Royal, according to the state, because we do have a state issued historic marker, according to them, we may be the only one in the state as we are, and possibly on a national level, we may be the only one that still exists as a community from the original community formed in 1865. So we're in Central Florida, close to Wildwood. Actually, when you're traveling Interstate 75, when you drive past over one of the bridges, you see my father's house. So we're right there, right off of Interstate 75 and State Road 44.
That's just incredible. And I love that you know this about your family. So Sabin, it's mind-blowing even to watch these celebrities learn about their families. How much advanced research goes into each segment?
Oh, well, one thing. So we've been doing this show a long time. I am not aware that we have ever had a guest who actually got the 40 acres and their families kept it, and much less that this community I hadn't heard of. It's really a fascinating story. We have had some guests over the years, particularly whose roots trace back to South Carolina, where they got the 40 acres and it was taken away from them, which is the more common story. That is an amazing story, really very inspiring, and makes me want to go to Royal, Florida. So
come on, join us.
I will do that. We spend, well, it varies. So as anyone who's done their family tree probably knows, depending on where your ancestors come from, you can spend quite a lot of time tracing your family, no matter where they come from. But certain ancestries tend to take longer, and some mysteries can never be solved. But we tend to spend on each of our guests anywhere from 3 months to a year. We have had guests. We have one coming up in this upcoming season I can't even remember how long I think we spent 5 years on her family tree. That was because she had a DNA mystery where her grandfather was, I'm sorry, where her mother had grown up hearing stories that her father was not her father. So that, in other words, that her mother, our guest's grandmother, had an affair. Turns out with a milkman, but don't want to spoil anything. But
Literally with the milkman.
literally with a milkman, yeah.
Such a cliche.
But yeah, no, I know it really paid off all of our dreams. But anyway, there were rumors, and we could prove that the rumors were true. That she was not actually from the person who she'd been raised to believe was her father and was the guest grandfather. We couldn't figure out how, where the person came in from, and we just had to wait for enough people to DNA test. And this was actually in England, where DNA testing is not as popular as in the United States. And we just waited and checked different things. We would see little hints in DNA databases that maybe this was like a third cousin of our guest. And finally, our genetic genealogists were able to put it together. But it took 5 years to identify the guest grandfather. Now, if it was 3 generations back, we might have just done the interview anyway. But since it's a grandfather, and since it was a family, we really wanted to be able to tell her who her grandfather was. So that is the longest that we ever done. But we frequently take a year. I mean, and it can really take time to do these things right.
That's amazing. And honestly, it's also a little depressing because as an average person who may never be on Finding Your Roots, I've got some aunts and uncles who do sort of the family genealogy. But Beverly, how can regular people like you and me learn our history without a production team that takes 1 year or 5 years, to share this information with us?
Well, I appreciate Spencer sharing there, not Spencer, but Sabin sharing there. It has taken me a lifetime to find the history I found about our community, because our history isn't taught in the schools. And to tell you the truth, I think I'm okay with that now, that it's not taught, because I don't know how it would be taught. And I think what I've discovered about my people here, I don't know if that would be taught in the school. So, but it has taken a time to get here. My aunt, who's the noted historian in the community, the history was given to her by my grandmother. And she always shared it at community events and church anniversaries and so forth. And I just, I heard it and I didn't hear it. But then when we were awarded, the center I'm sitting in is actually our historical and enrichment center here in the community. It was the old cafeteria, the last cafeteria for our segregated school sitting in the community. And that's where we had it renovated into the center. But when I got it, then I began to look into the missing parts of her history, which was I asked her why everybody had the 40 acres increments. Mr. Williams have 40. My grandfather still has 40. The Pattersons have 80. So I said, well, why the 40 acre increments? I didn't even know that. And I graduated 5th from my high school class, okay? And top of the class honors from college, and didn't know the 40 acres and a mule rule there, the special field order number 15 at the end of the war that awarded the land. And certainly didn't know that after President Lincoln was assassinated, Sabian, that President Johnson came in and the whole thing was rescinded and everybody lost their land. So I just thought African Americans all over the country had 40 acres because we had 40 acres, what I mean?
That's not true.
I don't think my family has 40 acres.
That's wrong.
I didn't know it was so rare, until we got this center. And when we started looking into it, it has been a process. We actually had to have a historic consultant come in and justify our oral history, because you have to remember that about African American history. Most of it is oral. So in which they did. They came in and did that. And he was the same historic consultant that justified the existence of Rosewood and how the state got a marker there. So we were blessed in that area.
Well, good for your family. Sabin, is there anything you would add to that in terms of how people can research our own families? And then once we have this information, what should we do with it? Like I was supposed to go to a family reunion last summer that was canceled because of COVID. They did some Zoom presentations instead. And what am I supposed to do with that PowerPoint so that my grandchildren will know that
That's a
information?
really good. I mean, so to double back a little bit to what you said earlier, it is true. Like I say this to people, it takes us 3 months or 2 years or whatever, but you can learn a lot. It's a, I don't know, it's like you know, you can learn a lot quickly. I always encourage people who are interested to try to do their own genealogy, and there are publicly available databases, these services, Ancestry, that you can really start to build a family tree very quickly. There are mysteries, there are things on the tree that may take years, but to sort of get a sense of where you come from, many people can learn stuff in a couple of months. I mean, or you start to get an idea. And certainly as you were just saying, that the idea of oral history for all people is incredibly important, because most people's families are not, I mean, this is something we find out in Roots almost all the time, is most people come from obscurity. I mean, you know, Black, white, Asian, what you may be, your great grandparents are usually not famous people. And for most people, the history that you have is, starts with oral history. So talking to your parents and grandparents, and, you know, if you're blessed to have great grandparents alive, is really invaluable, because when they go, a lot of stuff that they know will go too. And that's a commonplace, and people always say that, but we rely on our show on oral history a lot. We then go and double check it. And we hear crazy things in oral history that are not true. But we also hear, and we hear, interestingly, things that are partly true. And so, and without them, you sometimes can't find anything at all. So you may hear, oh, my great-great-grandfather came from Maryland to Texas, and swam across the Mississippi River on the way, and like, well, nobody swims across the Mississippi River, but the Maryland to Texas part may be true, and you may find something in Maryland that may, so it's like there's so often baked into oral history things, elements of truth, and so it's invaluable to us. We would get nowhere without oral history, but then you do have to check it against the written records, and that's what can take time, and that's what can sometimes be frustrating. But I think it can also be really rewarding to discover your great grandmother's story is there in documents, that they're, I mean, you obviously did that, you noticed the 40-acre parcels. Those are real things. Those are written down. I mean, I haven't seen them. I can't, but I mean, so I think it can be a very personally rewarding experience for people to check their family history. But it often starts with oral history. And I do think, like, when someone gives you an oral history, it's worth checking into, even if it sounds totally improbable, might be true.
I think it can be very rewarding. Beverly, what has it meant for you to know this history about your family? How has it influenced your life?
Well, it influenced my life greatly, because when I think about the people, the characteristics of the people that I grew up with that own these parcels, the families, I know them, I know the families, I know some of the generations, and I've seen them all my life. And I've always recognized that the people here in the community were very crafty. They were very swift, they were courageous, they were skillful. And the other thing that I noticed about them, they were hardworking, and they were always thankful. One of the reasons why I never realized what we had was because they were just thankful. They never boast about having the land. They just always say, we thank God for the land, because, and one thing you have to remember is that they had land, they had no money. They had land, they had no power, because we were still African American. So they were just always thankful for the land. So they didn't boast about it. All right. And one of the things with me is finding out about my roots is that I told you I'm a little girl, grew up here in Royal, a little community, and I went to Wildwood High School, graduated 5th. Then I went to college, FAMU, and then I went off to New York City. And I handled a $10 million department before the age of 30. And you can imagine what I encountered throughout this course of my life, and the different kind of people and from different areas and so forth and so on. And I felt like I fit right in. I didn't feel like I shouldn't be there. I felt like I fit right in. And it had a lot to do with when I started talking about my the women in my family, they were always courageous women, always the ones that always pushed the men to the front, always supported the man, always recognized the man as the man, but they were the ones working in the background, making the wheel roll. And I when I went off to college and school and corporate New York and wherever I'd gone in my life, Los Angeles, Chicago, wherever, I never felt like I didn't belong there because of what I remember about the women in my community. So it is very important to pass along, especially to the children, because today, even in my community, there are a lot of the younger generation that don't know this history. And if you talk to my aunt, who's the noted historian, and you say about the 40 acres and a mule, she would gladly put her hand on her hip and say, that's the stuff Beverly talking about, because she wasn't taught that part. She knows nothing of that part. She doesn't know. She just said, I don't know why the 40 acres, but except my mother told me that everybody got 40, some got 80, some got 120. So it's very, very significant to know where you came from in order to know where you're going.
Yeah. And it sounds like it gave you a sense of self. Like you come from a long line of strong women, so you can do anything. You belong at every table. Sabin, have you found that people had a sort of a lasting change when they found out something about their ancestry? It's nice to know, but like, how does it help us move through the world?
I think, well, it was really, what Beverly said is really moving. I mean, I think that that's reflective of what, how a lot of people see themselves in terms of like, oh, there were people there before me who struggled with some of the things that I struggle with. And I think that's comforting in some ways to know, that you aren't the first in your family to overcome certain things or to be just be challenged by them. And then I think like a lot of times people feel like, oh, they say this, that I have a debt to repay, that these people made immense sacrifices and had it harder than I did, generally. I mean, we're interviewing generally very successful people who, some of whom have had really tough childhoods or had really tough things happen to them, but who are in the present living, world-class lives. And and to see that their ancestors, came through, were enslaved or were immigrants who came here with nothing, not speaking the language, or, it's terrible things happen to them. I think it gives you a sense of, that you're not alone in the world, and that, you have a debt to pay backwards, and that, you, as you said very beautifully, like you belong at this table, you can go forward. And I think it's that's we hear that over and over and over from our guests. And sometimes we have guests who call us or reach out to us, years after they've been on the show with more questions about their ancestry, or want to give something to a relative or to a grand or to a child, and it obviously echoes with them beyond just the time we spend with them. I think that's really the value for anybody to do genealogy in some ways. It's sort of to have a firmer sense of your root, what makes you who you are.
Yeah, I mean, Roots is the perfect name for the show, Finding Your Roots. I was just at my parents' house for the first time in almost 2 years because of the pandemic.
Oh.
And they have all these black and white photos of like my great great grandparents. And every time I go there, I think I need to make a copy of this. And I didn't do it. But I need to ask them to send me a copy because I want those photos up on my wall for myself and my kids to see every day. I do kind of feel a sense of they sacrificed a lot, so I better not screw this up. Okay, but let's talk about some of the ancestors that maybe people are less proud of. We saw in the clip, Clint Black is part Black and Roseanne Cash is part Black, and they were excited about that and positive. But then what happens when there's a negative reaction to something in someone's past? Either they're a person of color and they didn't know it, or their ancestors enslaved other people and nobody.
So Clint Black is a good example. Clint Black, we could not identify who Clint Black's African ancestor is, but he has it in his DNA, so he clearly has an African ancestor. We could, however, identify Clint Black's slave owning ancestors. He had a number of, he was very much like, I'm not surprised. My family has been in Texas forever. It's a really ugly part of our history. it's in the show, and it can be very discomforting. I think most people who agree to be on the show have processed that, but they don't always sometimes comes as a surprise. We did Larry David, who I think probably came to us thinking he was like most of our Jewish guests, Ashkenazi, Jews come from Eastern Europe, come to the Eastern Seaboard, and are far removed from slavery. He had an ancestor who moved to Alabama and was part of Alabama's very, very small Jewish community and had a slave. And Larry David was just, he was appalled, but he, in his very Larry David way, was like, you got me. I'm not going to do a Larry David impersonation, but
Okay.
he processed it one way. You see people, we did Glenn Close, she was really, I think, deeply ashamed that but she knew she had wealthy Virginian ancestors. White people, they're the families, they can do the math. We've had guests that where, they've come to us wanting to have crimes in their family solved, to know whether, so-and-so in their family tree was a criminal. And you can have various different, we've had people whose great-grandparents killed each other, great-grandfather killed the great-grandmother, and no one ever spoke about it. They want to know the details, and we can often find out, so there can be some very hard things. And then of course, rape is a thing we encounter.
Exactly.
I think that I think that it's something that people process privately. Obviously they're by and large, people are used to being on camera. And so they talk to Dr. Gates about it. And there's a sort of a formal aspect to it that they are prepared to express. But I think there's a lot that goes on prior. And I think we've gotten feedback on that. I'm still thinking about this, months, years after the fact. I do think when you start to do your family history, it's not all going to be wine and roses. But I think that for most people, they've already accepted that idea, and they already they come to wanting to do this process because they want to learn. And there's that thing in you that you're scared to learn, but then learning, I think, can be a way of coming to peace with your who you are in a way. So
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Yeah, if you're going to open that Pandora's box, you better be ready for whatever may be inside. Beverly, Sabin just touched on some of the sort of ugly parts of some people's ancestry, slavery, rape, you name it, sleeping with the milkman. I'm curious what you both think about what we should tell our children, because it's important for us and we want to pass these facts down to the next generation. But I think about what's going on right now in public schools, about what's okay and what's not okay to say about, racism or gender equality, all these things. How would you sort of frame that? I'm a parent. I have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old. How do we begin to teach our kids about the good, the bad, and the ugly? Beverly, what do you think about that?
Well, most importantly, just speak the truth. Because, we also all have to realize that there are two sides to every story. And when we get one side of the story, it becomes very biased, and we're still not as educated and not as aware as we should be. So I think if we just speak the truth, we have an ugly story here in the community. Royal almost became a Rosewood, where we had a very similar situation happen with one of our Mr. Woods here in the community, where they claimed that a lady said that he did something inappropriate, and they locked him in the jail, but they didn't lock the cell. And that night they went in and pulled him out and drug him out, whipped him, and left inside the highway because they thought he was dead, but he didn't die. And actually, Robert Saunders, who had just replaced Harry T. Moore in the state of Florida as the NAACP Florida rep, was the one that came into the community and found his parents and actually located them, called the governor, and had him brought back to Sumter County to go to trial and so forth. But he would not identify the men. They had them all in court. He would not identify the men because he just felt, I know he felt, what would happen to the people in my community if I do. So even the good, bad, and ugly sometimes has a good twist to it at the end there. We did a presentation about him at one of our large community events, and I actually called him a community hero because, as the lady said, Mr. Jesse Woods, he did nothing, but he did do something. I believe what he felt he did was save this community. So we have to share both sides of the story and make certain that whatever you're sharing with them is important and enlightened, and where they can take it and build on it and build upon it to move forward in their lives. So that's how I would say we got to tell both sides of the story. There are a lot of people out there that are pushing to take down monuments, to take down statues and so forth. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but what I feel though is that we should have as many people out there pushing to put up a statue alongside those statues that tell the other side of the story. And then we can go forth, because as my grandmother would say, baby, it's written in the book, the Lamb Book of Life, and you can't change it. You just have to live with it. God knows it. And when you get there, you can't explain it. All you have to do is say, God, forgive me. And that's it, and move on.
Well, nobody can argue with great grandma. Okay, we have about 5 minutes. We have about 5 minutes left, but I'm glad you brought up Robert Saunders, because in Tampa, there's the Robert W. Saunders Senior Public Library, and they have a great African American history and genealogy department. So for people who aren't sure where to start, if you're African American, and even if you don't think you're African American, you might be another Clint Black, and that's just a great resource for our community.
Anything's possible.
Yeah, Sabin, I want your thought. What's a crazy surprise? Do you have any skeletons in your closet? And what do you think about what we should teach our kids and how to sort of get comfortable with the uncomfortable parts of our past?
Well, it is I mean, and I agree with Beverly said. It is. I think the more history you teach, the more history you can learn, the more you're going to see both sides. You're going to see that not that everybody was a good person by any means, but that at least they had motivations. There were forces at play. The complexity of history is I think really what's interesting, particularly from an adult perspective. I have two grown children, and I'm not sure if I succeeded in any of these things as a parent, but I tried, to teach them the ugly alongside the light. And I find what's shocking, as you sort of alluded to, is how little Americans know about our world, how little Americans know about our own history. I mean, and how we can have debates today about what should be taught, but I mean, it's probably more should be taught. I mean, there is just a tremendous amount of contradictory material in our past that understanding it will I think allow you to better come to a set of conclusions that we can all be comfortable with. It shocks me that we can have sort of basic debates today about what the Civil War was about. It seems to me rather obvious that it was a certain group of people who wanted to hold on to owning other people, but not everybody agrees with that. But I guess in my views, I think that if you knew more and whatever, you would come to a more coherent set of views. But it certainly can't help to know more, and to research your own family is a way to learn more. I mean, it can't hurt to know more. So I'm a big proponent of just trying to learn more with your family. It's obviously age appropriate stuff with young children that I'm just glad I don't have young children anymore.
I'm debating.
God bless.
I know you guys are hard at work on season 8, and I'm thinking, should I watch it with my kids? Maybe it's the kind of thing where I watch it first and then I pick out the parts that might be okay for them.
Yeah, the show is definitely made for adults. I do think children can watch it. Young, teenagers can watch it. We do teaching tools for middle schools and high schools and all kinds of things. I'm not sure how appropriate it is for a 5-year-old to realize your your grandfather might actually be the mailman. I mean, maybe they, again,
Okay,
I'm
for
just,
my 5-year-old, I promise you're not related to the mailman. At least I don't think so. Well, it was just such a fun conversation with both of you. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and that's why I just love Finding Your Roots so much. You all do a great job. Dr. Gates is a fantastic host. I know you're hard at work on season 8, so everyone can look for more information from WEDU about that. And in the meantime, I just want to say thank you so much, Sabin Streeter, executive producer of Finding Your Roots. And Beverly Steele is the founder of Young Performing Artists Incorporated. And I want to thank your organization. And I want to say thank you to my coworkers behind the scenes, Joyce Cotton, Spencer Hubbard, and Marty Galloway, who helped this conversation come together. Thank you so much for giving us some food for thought this summer.